Welcome to Introduction to Jazz. This is a course that's going to cover a lot of the different aspects of jazz from the earliest jazz on up through modern times. The text that we're going to be using for this particular course is this book. It's called Jazz from its Origins to the Present, and it's written by Lewis Porter, Michael Lehman, and Edward Hazell. So the book is very extensive and covers a lot of different topics, including some things about the earliest jazz. Also, we have some things that are about New Orleans, jazz in the 20s. We go into the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, 60s. There's bebop styles of jazz. We're going to talk about some cool jazz. There'll also be some things about 60s, because there was even some big bands in the 60s, and we have fusion. There's avant-garde that we'll be talking about, which is a very modern style of jazz playing, and then there's also some things about jazz singing as we go through into some of the later chapters, as well as just kind of a general conclusion about the whole program that we're going to be talking about. This is a class that I've actually done for quite some time now with another university, and it's been very successful with the students that participate and do some projects. There's some listening assignments that are part of the class, and one of the reasons we do so much listening is because it's very difficult to understand jazz unless you actually listen to the jazz. So I'm going to expect that people will be listening to the musical clips. They're all embedded in the course itself with links to particularly YouTube videos, which just happens to be one of the largest sources for a lot of this type of music. So I'm pretty sure that most of you will be able to watch these short clips. Some of them are as short as like 2 or 3 minutes, and then as we get into the later jazz periods, it'll start to become more and more detailed and may have as much as 20 minutes that could be recorded for one particular jazz song. And part of the reason is because of the improvisation that's added into the jazz pieces. So with that in mind, we have a lot of different topics that we'll be going through, and this introduction to jazz is basically starting with some of the earliest jazz, and there's actually a couple videos that are one is from Ken Burns particularly. That's a clip. It's not really long, but Ken Burns did a whole series on jazz and interviewed a lot of the modern jazz artists that were talking about their experience in working in New Orleans and Chicago, New York, which is kind of known as the Jazz Triangle. That's one of the pathways that jazz actually traveled. Part of the course will be discussing the origins of jazz and how it actually got started in New Orleans, and was had all sorts of cultural influences, such as the black African slaves that were in New Orleans at the time. The Civil War had just ended. We're going to be talking about the late 1800s into the early 1900s for this early jazz. And then as it goes through, there's also some French influence. There's the Creoles that are down in New Orleans also, along with some of the Southern gospel traditions, the spirituals and hymns, and marching bands. Composers like John Philip Sousa and the marching bands. He was the Marine band leader for many years and wrote all sorts of marches. So this style was also feeding into a type of music that was in early jazz called ragtime. So that's going to be explained in a little more detail. There are plenty of artists that are featured throughout the course, including some people like Louis Armstrong and Scott Joplin. Duke Ellington eventually will be featured, and as we go through, you'll get to know a lot of different people that are in jazz. The history of jazz is also a short documentary that's part of the course, and the history of jazz just kind of gives you a brief overview of some of the topics that we're talking about in this particular idea here. The intro to jazz is basically talking about the style of music that's unique to America. There are no other cultures in the world that actually have claim to this jazz. There are many people in and around the country that claimed that they were the first people that created jazz, but it really stems from the people in New Orleans and the style of jazz that's all around New Orleans. One of the major aspects of jazz is the blues. Blues is based on the kind of a experiences that are happening in people's lives, and it forms a very specific pattern. Usually it's 12 bars now. It wasn't always at the beginning 12 bar blues, but that's what it has been used, and even people as late as the Rolling Stones use this particular style. So we'll be talking a lot about that, and reading about it and listening to some videos that have some very famous blues people that created very memorable pieces. Some of them like the St. Louis Blues, the Memphis Blues, and some other ones. The couple other videos that are embedded in here have to do with how to play a blues scale. As part of the course, it's very important to have some practical experience also. So I actually showed a video that gives you an idea of how to play a blues scale in the key of C, and talking about flatted notes and how that actually works. So if you go through that, you'll get a chance to see how that works also. And then I included a very famous piece called the C Jam Blues that was written by Duke Ellington and a little later on, but it's based on this 12-bar blues pattern. So the early bands were basically derived from the early marching bands. The instrumentation that was used in these bands usually included a trumpet or a cornet. More likely in the beginning would be a cornet, which is a slightly smaller version of the trumpet. It's a 3-valve brass instrument. You have to buzz your lips in order to play. The clarinet was another featured instrument in these earliest bands. And then we have some other instruments like the banjo, or it could be a guitar. Occasionally in some of the later bands, as it develops, they started using instruments like the saxophone, but definitely not in the earliest bands. There was often a tuba player to play the bass line, but if a tuba player wasn't available and they were inside, they could use a string bass player. So that's another potential for keeping the group together. Now, if it was also available, and again inside because they couldn't march with these, but pianos could be used also, and they were used as an accompaniment for the basic outline of the chords, and a lot of rhythmic elements that were in there, especially when you get into some of the types of music like ragtime, where it has a really strong left hand that's basically a kind of a marching beat pattern, a 1-2 1-2 pattern, and the right hand does a lot of syncopation, it's called, where it's kind of an offbeat pattern and does a lot of crazy rhythms in the right hand when you're going through that. So we have an example of some of that ragtime music in Maple Leaf Rag, it's called, by Scott Joplin. Very famous ragtime piece, and if you listen to that piece, you'll understand more about what we're talking about as far as the ragged tune. W.C. Handy was another person that had kind of published a lot of different blues songs, and then some of the bands that were playing started picking up some of these tunes and adapting them for their own. Actually, some of the earliest bands would play for funerals, and they would have these slow dirges, marches, hymns that they would play, and then after the funeral was over and they started to exit the church, the earliest bands often would play an up-tempo piece that would be kind of joyous and help to carry that dead person with some high-spirited feeling in their march type of music, and the band would kind of accompany the crowd to the cemetery as they're walking down the streets in New Orleans, with sometimes with fancy clothes, and they had a leader usually that would be in front of the group, often strutting his stuff, as they said. So kind of very showy also. So it was a very unique time where they put a lot of different elements together. Another instrument that was part of these early bands was called the trombone, and the trombone added a slide feature to it that could help to enhance the harmony roll. There are also drums that could be used in these different pieces, and some of the drums that were used would be like the snare drums. Occasionally there would be a marching band that would have a big bass drum that would carry, but most of the time it was just a snare drummer that was carrying the snare drum, usually strapped to their leg with a strap around their shoulder, and two wooden sticks to hit the drum to make the sounds there to kind of keep everybody in tempo together. As eventually we'll see, this single instrument of each one of them, so 4, 5, 6 instruments, is going to start to lead into much larger groups, which we'll talk about as we go through and have some changes as it goes through the 20s and into the 1930s with some of the early swing bands. But for right now, the earliest development was the people that picked up instruments at various places. Many of them could read music, but a lot of them couldn't, and some of them just had picked up instruments that were left over from the Civil War, picked them up at a store, a shop, and just started playing the instruments. Many of the famous people like Louis Armstrong were actually picking up the instruments, and sometimes not even playing on good horns, but would be playing what they heard in their head, and be well known then for their style of music. King Oliver was another person down in New Orleans. So there's just a lot of people that we're going to be talking about. And the book, again, which I definitely highly recommend you get right away in order to study this a little bit more, is called Jazz from Its Origins to the Present. And this book will be very useful in helping you. In fact, all of the references that are in the topic outlines here are going to be page references in that particular book. And you could potentially study this course without the book, but it will be a much easier if you can. And there's a couple links that are at the beginning of the course that you can actually use to click on a site that has prices that are very reasonable, anywhere from like $10 to $80. I've seen this book. You can get them used, you can get them brand new, and it will make a big difference as far as your understanding if you get a chance to read it. And of course, then I'll reiterate the fact that it's very important to do the listening. It's critical. It's almost impossible to understand what the authors are talking about as far as the jazz goes without doing the actual listening and figuring out how the various styles were created and developed from the earliest jazz on up through modern times. I'm really looking forward to spending some more time telling you more about jazz and how it was developed. So join me again for the next time when we put this together and create this history of jazz, jazz from its origins through the present day. So enjoy the music.